Let's talk about the U.S.'s relationship with Israel.
We stand with Israel.
I love Israel. I love Israel.
The bond between our two countries is unbreakable.
The eternal friendship.
Relationship is very important.
We are you and you are us.
It's a relationship that's always been super close, but it's been getting more attention recently. After Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, and Israel launched its war on Gaza.
The U.S. is moving a tremendous amount of firepower and manpower as a show of support to Israel.
A significant increase in American support.
Basically comparable to a blank check.
No questions asked, not even a debate.
Now, there are lots of layers to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and it's tied up in at least 75 years of pretty complicated history. But here are 4 things to know that'll help explain what's behind it, what's kept it going, and where it's at now. The first thing to know is that the U.S. has supported Israel from the very beginning. Israel declared itself a state in 1948 on land that had previously been Palestine under British control. More than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes. And the U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel. President Truman did it just 11 minutes after its creation. The idea of establishing a nation for Jewish people had been gaining momentum for decades. It was the main goal of a movement called Zionism, which started in the late 1800s. Zionists believed that a Jewish homeland was the only way to ensure safety for Jews, who'd suffered persecution around the world for centuries.
The United States supported the Zionist idea from the very beginning. It was almost natural that the United States would be the first to recognize the existence of the State of Israel.
There was great sympathy for the Zionist project throughout the 1930s and 40s, for example. And of course, after the Holocaust, that was combined with enormous sympathy for the genocide that was carried out against the Jewish people in Europe. And that helped pave the way for Western and particularly American support for the establishment of a Jewish state.
The other thing was that President Harry Truman was facing an election, and he didn't want to sacrifice any possible edge that he could have over his opponent.
Now, something both the U.S. and Israel highlight a lot is the idea of shared values. It can be hard to pin down exactly what those values are, but many U.S. politicians talk about Israel as
the only democracy in the Middle East.
A lot of people might criticize this idea that both the U.S. and Israel are beacons of democracy. But whatever you think about that, it's a narrative they both like to emphasize.
America is a nation of immigrants, strengthened by diversity, enriched by faith. We're fueled by entrepreneurship and innovation, and we are defined by a democratic discourse. So in Israel, we see values that we share.
They seem to feel they have an alignment of values that perhaps the United States doesn't feel it has with Muslim nations in the Middle East. And they feel that Israel's strategic desires and America's strategic desires dovetail significantly. And I think that's something that draws them together.
So here's the next point to know. As well as those shared values, the U.S. and Israel are strategic partners. What does that mean? Well, basically that they both get something concrete out of the relationship that serves their national interest. And it really started with the Cold War.
Significant news from Russia.
That's the period after the Second World War until the late 1980s, when the U.S. and the Communist Soviet Union were competing to be the dominant global power. And that rivalry played out in the Middle East too, especially in Egypt, Israel's neighbor. Keep in mind that 5 Arab countries, including Egypt, went to war with Israel right after it was created.
Colonel Nasser holds a parade.
In 1955, Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser bought weapons from the Soviet Union.
We have to defend our country against aggression.
That shifted the military balance in the region against Israel and marked a new division in the Middle East.
With that, Nasser separated himself from the West, and the Middle East was divided into 2 camps, pro-Soviet and pro-Western.
Now here's the thing. Israel had been asking the U.S. for weapons since 1950. It said it needed them to maintain a military edge over hostile Arab neighbors. And in 1962, the U.S., under President Kennedy, finally agreed.
Kennedy laid the foundation for what would later become a closer relationship and one that had a strategic dimension.
That increased exponentially after the 1967 war, when Israel not only fended off Arab states in 6 days, but also managed to conquer land from Jordan, Syria, and Egypt.
And with time, Israel started to offer more and more strategic gains and advantages to the United States.
They've got intelligence gathering abilities that are pretty efficient, and they're also funneling a lot of this information back to the United States.
So what does Israel get out of its relationship with the U.S.? Well, among other things, a lot of money. Since the Second World War, the United States has given more money to Israel than any other country, about $260 billion in total. That included economic aid until 2008, but now the U.S. only gives money for military spending. Israel gets $3.8 billion a year as part of a deal signed by President Obama. These American taxpayer dollars have helped Israel build up one of the most powerful militaries in the world. With the latest American fighter jets and an advanced missile defense system called Iron Dome. But one important thing to know about the money given to Israel is that almost all of it has to be spent in the U.S.
America provides essentially grants for Israel to buy American military hardware.
So it's kind of a self-licking ice cream cone, really. I mean, you give all this money, but it's actually spent on industries that are in key congressional districts.
Another thing about this military aid is that the U.S. really doesn't attach any conditions to it, either in terms of how the weapons are used or as a way to pressure Israel on any of its policies, like the way it treats Palestinians, for example.
Israel essentially is given a blank check with regard to the military hardware, the technology, the resources that the United States provides. There is little or no scrutiny. Theoretically, there are laws in place, for example, the Leahy laws, that U.S. military hardware can only be used for defensive purposes and can't be used in violation of human rights standards. We've never seen those conditions or those provisions applied in the Israeli case.
So how do we explain this blank check approach? Well, some of it comes down to domestic U.S. politics, where generally being pro-Israel pays off politically. And one way to look at that is by looking at public opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Sympathy for Israelis has consistently polled higher than sympathy for Palestinians, although the gap's been narrowing a bit recently. Something else to consider is that a big voting constituency in the U.S. are evangelical or born-again Christians. They make up about a quarter of the U.S. population, and they are overwhelmingly pro-Israel.
Israel is not a political issue, it's a Bible issue. Israel is the only nation on earth created by a sovereign act of God.
Jewish people are God's chosen people. The Bible says 55 times that land shall be Israel's land forever.
We are talking about millions of people who believe that what is written in the Bible is a pure truth. So if God promised to Abraham that the land of Israel would be his and of his descendants, then this is what should happen.
Another element in U.S. political support for Israel is the influence of pro-Israel lobby groups like AIPAC. Now, there are different schools of thought on just how much influence lobby groups like AIPAC actually have in practice. Are they really shaping policy, or are they just promoting policies already popular with politicians and the public? Whatever the case, U.S. leaders certainly pay attention.
Well, hello, AIPAC.
What a remarkable crowd.
It is wonderful to be here and see so many friends.
AIPAC has long been able to direct funds to candidates for office on the basis of that candidate's attitudes towards Israel, especially in the House of Representatives, where, they're, running for office every 5 minutes. They need a constant flow of money.
What the Jewish Israel lobby do is not forcing policy on the United States, as many academics and pundits are arguing. They present a policy that they argue would be preferable to Israel. If these interests are aligned with the American interests, then the United States would go for it.
So you've got all of these elements that feed into the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. There's the history, those shared values, strategic interests, religion, and broad public and political support. all of this has sustained the relationship, to the point where some people say it goes pretty much unchallenged. And that's where a lot of the criticism also comes in, especially in the context of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory and a system that human rights groups have described as apartheid. One view of the US-Israel relationship is that it basically enables this to the detriment of both Palestinians and Israelis.
Because crucial to this relationship is that America is the guarantor of Israeli impunity. We could not be where we are today if America had not got us to a place where there are no costs and consequences internationally, legally, in terms of sanctions at the UN, etc., for the way Israel treats the Palestinians day in, day out for generations. And I wonder how much America is waking up to that.
So is the alliance under pressure? Well, it's hard to say. But events following the Hamas attack on October 7th have put it on full display.
Let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back.
Plenty of people are questioning it, perhaps more than before.
Biden, you can't hide! Biden, you can't hide!
The United States of America provides $3.8 billion every year to Israel. We have a right to say, sorry, you need a new military strategy.
But whether that will translate into any tangible change is something else.
Congress is still overwhelmingly in line with the traditional pro-Israel stance that is largely uncritical and in many cases hostile toward Palestinians.
A lot will depend on how the Gaza war plays out, what Israel does next, and how the US government responds. We do all kinds of explainers on news events and current affairs on Start Here. You can check out our YouTube playlist here.
I want to talk to you about the F word. No, not that F word. I'm talking about fascism. Is Donald Trump really a fascist, as some would say? Or is the word authoritarian sufficient? The term fascism is often used loosely, but you can generally identify fascists by their hate of the other, vengeful nationalism, and repression of dissent. To fight these ideas, we need to be aware of what they are and how they fit together. Let's examine the 5 elements that define fascism and what makes it distinct from and more dangerous than authoritarianism. First, the rejection of democracy in favor of a strongman. Authoritarians believe strong leaders are needed to maintain stability, so they empower strongmen, dictators, or absolute monarchs to maintain social order through the use of force. But fascists view strong leaders as the means of discovering what society needs. They regard the leader as the embodiment of society, the voice of the people.
I am your voice. I alone can fix it.
Second, stoking rage against cultural elites. Authoritarian movements cannot succeed without at least some buy-in from establishment elites. While fascist movements often seek to co-opt the establishment, they largely depend on fueling resentment and anger against presumed cultural elites for supposedly displacing regular people. Fascists rile up their followers to seek revenge on the elites.
The out-of-touch media elites, the political elites, but the elites from the elites who led us from one financial and foreign policy disaster to another.
They create mass political parties and demand participation. They encourage violence.
You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
Knock the crap out of him, would you?
And we fight. We fight like hell.
Third, nationalism based on superior race and historic bloodlines. Authoritarians see nationalism as a means of asserting the power of the state. For fascists, the state embodies what is considered a superior group based on race, religion, and historic bloodlines. To fascists, the state is a means of asserting that superiority.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you.
Fascists worry about disloyalty and replacement by groups that don't share the same race or bloodlines.
And I think any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat, I think it shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty.
Fascists encourage their followers to scapegoat, expel, and sometimes even kill such others. Fourth, extolling brute strength and heroic warriors. The goal of authoritarianism is to gain and maintain state power at any cost. For authoritarians, strength comes in the form of large standing armies that can enforce their rule. They seek power to wield power. Fascists seek state power to achieve their ostensible goal, achieving their vision of society. Fascism accomplishes this by rewarding those who win economically and physically, and denigrating or even exterminating those who lose. Fascism depends on organized bullying, a form of social Darwinism.
Our people are tougher and stronger and meaner and smarter.
For the fascist, war and violence are means of strengthening society by culling the weak and glorifying heroic warriors.
I am your warrior. I am your justice. I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
Fifth and finally, disdain of women and LGBTQ+ people. Authoritarianism imposes hierarchies. It's about order. Fascism's idea of order is organized around a particular hierarchy of male dominance. The fascist heroic warrior is male. Women are relegated to subservient roles. In fascism, anything that challenges the traditional heroic male roles of protector, provider, and controller of the family is considered a threat to the social order. Fascism seeks to eliminate homosexuals, non-binary, transgender, and queer people because they are thought to challenge or weaken the heroic male warrior.
I will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that the only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth.
These 5 elements of fascism fit together and reinforce each other. Rejection of democracy in favor of a strong man depends on galvanizing popular rage. Popular rage draws on a nationalism based on a supposed superior race or ethnicity. That superior race or ethnicity is justified by a social Darwinist idea of strength and violence, as exemplified by heroic warriors. Strength, violence, and the heroic warrior are centered on male power. These 5 elements find exact expression in Donald Trump. His uniquely American version of fascism is rooted largely in white Christian nationalism. It is the direction that most of the Republican Party is now heading in. It's not enough to call Trump and those promoting his ideas authoritarians, when what they are really advocating is something far worse: fascism.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
The 2016 Republican presidential nominee disregards the norms of adult behavior. He disregards the norms of American democracy as we know it.
It should be heartbreaking to every American that we have a front-runner that suggests there will be a religious test for anybody who wishes to come to our shores.
He's so unusual, his rhetoric at times so extreme, that political experts and commentators were blindsided by his rise.
We better be ready for the fact that he might be leading the Republican ticket.
Next, I know you don't believe that, but I want to go on.
How did Donald Trump attract such broad support within the Republican Party? And what does it mean for the U.S. beyond this election?
And it turns out that this is a question that can be answered to a really surprising extent via this niche field of political science. It developed a theory about what's called authoritarianism.
We're not talking about dictatorships. Authoritarianism is a term political scientists use for a worldview that values order and authority and distrusts outsiders and social change. And when authoritarians feel threatened, they look for strongman leaders.
Leaders who are punitive, who target outgroups, and who have a simple, forceful leadership style that makes them feel strong. And if you were going to grow that candidate in a lab,
I'm going to bomb the shit out of them.
he would look a lot like Donald Trump.
When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their lives. Don't kid yourself. But they say they don't care about their lives. You have to take out their families.
Authoritarianism is not in and of itself necessarily a partisan issue.
For most of this country's history, authoritarians were likely divided between the two parties. But now, only one of the parties really appeals to them.
What happened was the Republican Party started to embrace what it referred to as traditional values, and it stood against a series of major social changes in this country.
After initially supporting civil rights, Republicans began courting Southern white voters who opposed racial integration. They turned against the Equal Rights Amendment, denounced abortion, and later fought against same-sex marriage.
Our nation must enact a constitutional amendment to protect marriage in America.
More recently, foreign threats like terrorism have become major political issues, with Republicans taking positions that align with authoritarian fears and preferences.
So Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler, two political scientists, they tracked data over several decades, and they found that authoritarian voters were shifting into the Republican Party. So that means that when authoritarians become scared, when they become activated by a particular social change or issue, the Republican Party can't ignore them, and they are a ready-made constituency for a candidate like Donald Trump.
Are you going to have a massive deportation force?
You're going to have a deportation force. I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
Testing people for authoritarianism is a bit tricky.
You can't necessarily just ask people, are you really freaked out by social change? Do racial differences unsettle you? Do you support strongman leaders? Because those are very sensitive questions, and people won't necessarily answer them honestly.
So instead, political scientists ask people about something more neutral: their parenting preferences.
Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have: independence or respect for elders, obedience or self-reliance.
These questions seem like they're about raising children, but really what they're asking people is how much they value order and authority.
So when political scientists tested these four parenting questions against the behaviors that they knew authoritarians exhibited, they found out that the correlation was very close. It was very predictive, at least for white voters.
Using this four-question test, Vox worked with Morning Consult in February 2016 to poll a large sample of likely voters.
Our results yielded a few really interesting things. The first one was that, yes, scoring high on the authoritarianism questions was very predictive of support for Trump.
A political science PhD student named Matthew McWilliams has found similar results.
He's done two polls, both of which have found that authoritarianism is not only strongly predictive of Trump support, but that it seems to do a better job of predicting it than virtually any other factor.
We also looked at what authoritarian voters are afraid of.
On things like car accidents, or the risk of gun violence, or prescription drugs, there wasn't a huge difference between authoritarians and non-authoritarians. But when it came to threats associated with people, and particularly foreign people, authoritarians were much more afraid.
And we identified policies that authoritarians were more likely to support.
So authoritarians were much more likely to say, for instance, that the United States should use force rather than diplomacy when dealing with countries that threaten our interests overseas. And they were much more likely to want to sacrifice civil liberties in exchange for safety.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay.
I want surveillance.
It's a set of priorities that doesn't always align with the Republican establishment.
They don't seem to have that much interest in small government, and they definitely don't seem particularly interested in shrinking entitlements like Social Security or Medicaid.
This theory doesn't fully explain the Trump phenomenon. Researchers will probably study this election for decades. But what it tells us is that he's benefited from a larger shift in this country, one that goes beyond any one candidate.
Trump isn't just a fluke. He's not somebody who's just doing well because he had name recognition or was a famous TV star. This is a large group of people. They want these things, and they're going to be looking for politicians who can give it to them. And that means that Donald Trump could be just the first of many Trumps in American politics.
I love the old days. You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks. That's true.
Guns have been around for centuries, but no nation has embraced the firearm as much as the United States. Of the 857 million civilian-owned guns in the world, Americans own nearly half of them. But what's behind our obsession with firearms?
As a crime reporter, I wanted to show how easy it is for the average American to buy a gun.
This is our colleague, Andy Campbell. In 2016, Andy traveled to Orlando after the Pulse nightclub shooting,
which was, at the time, one of the worst shootings in American history,
to see how easily he could buy a gun. And not just any gun. Andy wanted to buy this country's most popular assault rifle, the AR-15.
It looks like a military-style weapon. It's supposed to look intimidating. It's supposed to be scary. It's supposed to put you off guard. This type of marketing makes these types of guns fly off the shelves. It makes them attractive to young people.
The National Rifle Association calls it America's rifle and claims it's often used for hunting. The truth is,
its only use is to kill people. There's no reason to use a semi-automatic gun to kill a deer, for instance.
So how long did it take Andy to buy an AR-15 military-style semi-automatic assault rifle? We'll get back to that. Before we talk about buying a gun in the 21st century, we first need to go back to the 18th century, where guns were
unreliable, they were perishable, they were very unwieldy. Many of them only lasted a year or so. They were prone to rust and rot, water damage of different kinds.
This is Priya Sathya, a professor at Stanford University who studies the history of firearms.
So when the American colonies rebelled against Britain in the 1770s, they could no longer count on getting firearms from the British for obvious reasons. And then after the war is over, it becomes a kind of government priority to invest in firearms manufacturing capacity within the newly independent United States.
So Americans made their own, thanks in part to George Washington's foresight.
George Washington really spearheads this effort to create government-run firearms factories.
Then, in the 19th century,
you see those developing into large-capacity factories.
This begins America's long history as a dominant firearms manufacturer. By the time the Civil War has ended, America begins pushing west. And this westward expansion depended on
armed men going out and engaging in wars with Native Americans.
But the proliferation of guns always came with the proliferation of something else, gun control. Because
there's an interest in attracting settlers, so they need to look like safe places to live, not actually a Wild West. So in the 19th century, if you went to, a small town in Kansas or one of these new places opening up in the West, there would be signs greeting you that would say, leave your revolver at police headquarters and you'll get a receipt for that. So people weren't actually walking around in these towns fully armed.
The mythology of an early American society replete with lax gun laws was a 20th century invention.
And it's an NRA promoted myth. It's also something that shows up in Hollywood movies at the same time. The kind of really loose interpretation that we have of the Second Amendment now is something that you can date from the 1980s onward.
Starting in the 1980s and 90s, developed countries begin responding to rampant gun violence by restricting civilian gun ownership. A 1989 mass shooting in Canada leads to the passing of the Firearms Act 5 years later. In 1987, the Hungerford Massacre in England leads the UK to pass the Firearms Amendment Act. And in 1996, following the Port Arthur Massacre, Australia bans nearly all automatic and semi-automatic weapons. So gun manufacturers focused their attention on the one developed country that was still open for business, the United States.
Because markets everywhere else in the world were either glutted or they had really tight controls on civilian ownership of guns. So it became more and more important for the American civilian market to be open and for Americans to believe that to be American is to own not just one gun, but all the guns you can. So this is something that's being actively promoted by the NRA, which is representing gun manufacturers.
And from there, gun sales grew in the United States.
As a national crime reporter, I write the same story at least once a week, sometimes every day. Often I will be flying back from one shooting only to be turned around and fly to another shooting. This has happened several times in my 7 years here at HuffPost. Gun violence is such an issue that we have a hard time deciding which ones to cover.
Priya, how long do you think it took our colleague Andy to buy an AR-15 in Orlando immediately following the Pulse nightclub shooting?
Zero time? I don't know. How fast was it?
During a state of emergency, I bought an AR-15 in about 38 minutes.
38 minutes? I thought it would be faster.
The only reason it took 38 minutes and not less time is because
there was such a backup of people buying guns.
The irony of mass shootings is that for the gun industry, they're actually good for business.
The only way to keep civilians in America continually engaged in buying ever more guns is by encouraging this fear that they're about to lose the right to buy guns.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment.
There's a sort of spate of panic buying.
Their goal is to eliminate the Second Amendment.
Every time there's a mass shooting, Americans donate to the NRA.
We're here. We're not going anywhere.
And they buy AR-15s en masse.
To stop a bad guy with a gun, it takes a good guy with a gun.
And in turn, a vicious cycle continues.
As guns pervade American society, so do mass shootings. It's why you look at the exits when you go to the theater. It's why, parents are telling their kids how to shelter safely at school. It's why you don't feel safe at a yoga studio anymore.
And perhaps the most devastating part of all,
now mass shootings have become part of American culture. It's something that goes on that we don't correct. Mass shootings have occurred in other places and then action was immediately taken to prevent it from happening again. The kind of peculiar refusal in America to take that kind of action, that's American, and then the mass shootings themselves are now solidly part of American culture.
Our youth is growing up in an environment where they expect that walking out the door comes with an inherent risk. I heard students saying, "I'm not surprised," as often as they said, "I can't believe this is happening."
Israel has a fascism problem.
נכון, אני לא יכולה לומר, אני באמת יכולה לומר לעצמי שיש בי משהו פשיסטי, כאילו.
It is hurting not just the thousands of Palestinians killed, wounded, or displaced under the occupation, but also the Jewish people Israel claims to be protecting. Zionism is built upon the idea of a Jewish homeland. But in that Jewish homeland, not all Jews are equal. The founders of Zionism, like Theodor Herzl, and Israel's early state builders, were all Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazim are white European Jews hailing from Eastern and Central Europe and the former Russian Empire. Herzl wrote a famous novel.
Theodor Herzl's famous book Alt Neuland, or Old New Land, which envisioned the modern state of Israel years before its creation.
The book also talked about Israel as small Europe in the Middle East. But not all Jews are Ashkenazim, and not all Ashkenazim are Zionists.
All the rabbis around the world for 130 years since Zionism started spoke up in every way, in every style that they had, and declared that Zionism is sinful, is a criminal, and is totally unacceptable according to my religion.
That's Rabbi Yisrael Dovid Weiss. He is one of the many anti-Zionist Jews around the world. In fact, prior to the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel, Zionism was a fringe minority movement among the world's Jewry. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, as survivors and Zionists started to emigrate to Palestine, there was an immense need for manpower to build and populate this new formation. In 1911, David Ben-Gurion, who would later become Israel's first prime minister, went on record saying, "We need people who are born workers. We have to pay attention to the local element, the Oriental Jews, both the Yemenite and Sephardic. Their standard of living and their needs are lower." So to get builders and soldiers and not be overwhelmed demographically by Palestinians, the Zionist project was an urgent need of Jewish immigration. According to Professor Aziza Kazoum, European colonialists would often treat local minorities and Muslim lands, like Jews and Armenians, as allies and reward them for their cooperation against local authorities. This led to increased tensions between communities. Moreover, the creation of Israel by way of a mass ethnic cleansing and displacement of 750,000 Palestinians increased tensions that already existed. All these tensions led some Arab Jews to migrate, but the number of Jews relocating to Israel wasn't enough for the Zionist Ashkenazi state builders. To accelerate the process, Zionist spies planted bombs in Jewish centers in Iraq to create hysteria and panic in order to hasten Jewish Iraqis to flee Iraq and emigrate to Israel. Israeli Jewish historian Avi Shlaim, whose family emigrated to Israel from Iraq when he was 5, told Middle East Eye.
It was part of what somebody described as cruel Zionism. And this was particularly cruel because it involved innocent Jews, decent Jews, good people, and the Zionist movement or the intelligence officers turned these Jews in Baghdad and then later in Cairo, they turned them into terrorists. They turned them into spies and terrorists against their own homeland.
Over the decades, a combination of push and pull factors eventually led many Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews to emigrate to the State of Israel. But they were less than welcomed.
The Jewish community in Iraq had very little to do with Zionism. Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. And my mother used to talk a great deal about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. And I think that reflected the predominant view of Iraqi Jews.
And a white savior story was constructed about how Middle Eastern Jews were saved from savage Muslims as well as the savagery within themselves. The discrimination against non-white Jews is a well-documented phenomenon in many sectors of life in Israel. including in education, reproductive rights, the military, and others. One of these shocking stories was accusations against the Israeli government of eugenic practices. Families claimed that officials had coerced Ethiopian Jewish women to take contraceptive drugs with long-lasting effects. Critics said it could explain the almost 50% decline over the past 10 years in the birth rate of Israel's Ethiopian community. Ethiopians were not alone in their grievances. The Israeli government is accused of separating Yemenite Jews from their children when the families immigrated to Israel decades ago. The officials told parents their children had died, but did not provide any evidence or the bodies of the deceased. Journalists and the families of the victims later discovered that in some cases, the children had been experimented upon in hospitals, while alive as well as after they died, in violation of Jewish tradition, and some others had been given up for adoption or even sold to white Ashkenazi Holocaust survivors. Many non-white Jewish communities from Iraq, Yemen, Ethiopia, and other places around the world have long been a victim of the Zionist racial hierarchy. Israeli academic of Iraqi origin Ella Shobat writes, "I am not asking Palestinians to feel sorry for the Sephardi soldiers who might be among those shooting at them. What is at stake in any case is not a competition for sympathy, but a search for alternative." These words, written in 1988, are still relevant today. What do you think? Is Zionism a white supremacist project?
In the past few weeks, I have been called a self-hating Jew. I've been called an October 7th denier. I've been called a lot of different names. It's really important to be here and show solidarity, especially as a Jewish American. It's hard for me to see people talk about the Free Palestine movement and call it anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel. It's not anti-Semitic to call it a genocide. I'm coming every single day. I'm in finals right now. It's been so peaceful. There's many Jewish groups here. It's hard to see, especially Jewish organizations on campus silencing Jewish students who are speaking out against Israel. I've realized that maybe I don't want to align with those certain organizations or certain Jewish organizations. I think one issue is that a lot of funding that colleges receive is from Jewish donors, and I feel disgusted by the Zionist institutions that try to justify this genocide in the name of Judaism. I think it's honestly disgusting.